My future sister-in-law was gripping the stem of her champagne flute so hard I thought it would snap in her hand. She kept glancing at my brother, then at the laptop sitting open on the head table like it was a slot machine about to pay out. The string quartet was still playing something soft from the corner of the banquet hall at the Fairmont Royal York, but nobody at our table was listening. My mother had that look on her face she always got when money was close enough to taste, that tight little smile that didn't reach her eyes, the one I'd seen at every birthday and every Christmas and every funeral where there was a will to be read. My father just kept clearing his throat. I sipped my wine and watched them. They thought I was the same girl who'd cried in the garage at 16. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name is Hollis. I'm 31. I live in Toronto now, in a little condo near the distillery district that I paid for with money my grandmother left me. And I work for the Canada Revenue Agency in a department that doesn't exactly have a public-facing nameplate on the door. Forensic side of things. Tracing money that doesn't want to be traced. It's the kind of job you don't really talk about at dinner parties. Because the second you say where you work, somebody starts nervously laughing about their cash-in-hand renovation guy. So I just tell people I'm an accountant and let them lose interest. My family thinks I'm an accountant too. A regular one. A boring one. Which was exactly what I needed them to think. I grew up in a town outside Hamilton with my parents and my older brother. My brother is the kind of person who could fall into a septic tank and come out smelling like cologne, and my parents loved him for it. He was the golden one, the charming one, the one who got the new hockey skates while I got hand-me-downs from a cousin I'd never met. When he flunked out of his second year at Western, my parents remortgaged the house to send him to a private business program in Calgary. When I got into McGill on a partial scholarship, my mother told me they couldn't help with the rest because things were tight. Things were not tight. My mother had just bought a sunroom. The thing that broke me, though, the thing that made me understand who these people actually were, happened when I was 16. It was a Friday night in November, the kind of wet cold that gets in your bones. My brother was supposed to be the designated driver for a party out at the lake. He wasn't. He drove my mother's Lexus off the road and into a maple tree at the bottom of somebody's long, rural driveway. He blew well over the limit when the OPP showed up. He was 19, almost 20, old enough that this would have followed him forever. But I was 16. My mother got there before the ambulance did. I know this because my mother told me, in the car on the way home from the police station, the same way you tell someone you switched the laundry over. She said it had taken her about 90 seconds to make the decision. She'd told my brother to get out of the driver's seat and walk into the trees. Then she'd called me. She'd told me she'd needed a ride. She'd told me she was hurt. I biked over because I didn't have my license yet. By the time I got there, sirens were already coming up the concession road, and my mother was standing beside the wreck with my brother's wallet in her hand and a small, deep cut on her own forehead that she'd given herself with the edge of the rearview mirror. She told the officers I'd been driving. She told them she'd been in the passenger seat. She told them I'd panicked and run. I was 16 and I was scared, and my mother was crying and saying, "Please, please, sweetheart. Your brother has his whole life ahead of him. You're tougher than this. You'll bounce back. Juvenile records get sealed. Just say yes. Just say yes. Just say yes." I said yes. I got a youth conviction. I lost the McGill scholarship because the offer was conditional on a clean record disclosure. I ended up at a community college in Burlington doing accounting because it was what I could afford with what I had left of my summer job money and what my grandmother quietly slipped me in cash envelopes she said were for groceries. My brother kept the scholarship to that Calgary business program. My parents threw him a going-away party. I wasn't invited because, my mother said, it might make people ask questions about my situation. That was the year my grandmother started looking at me differently, like she was taking inventory. My grandmother's name was Constance. She'd been widowed since I was a baby, and she lived alone in a cedar shingled house up on Georgian Bay that her own mother had built before the war. She'd been a high school English teacher for 38 years. She read everything. She didn't miss anything. She started inviting me up on weekends. We'd walk down to the water and she'd ask me questions, the same way you'd ask a witness, gentle and patient and circling. I told her the truth about the car eventually. I'd never told anyone before. She didn't gasp. She didn't get angry in front of me. She just nodded and said, "I thought so." And then she made us tea. She set up the trust 6 months later. I didn't know until much later how she'd done it, what she'd locked down, what she'd left out of her will on purpose. I just knew that when she died of a stroke, The week after my 24th birthday, I was the only grandchild who got a phone call from her lawyer. The trust came to me at 25. It was a little over $2.4 million, mostly in long-held investments my grandfather had left her, plus the deed to the cedar house on the bay, which she'd put into the trust outside the estate so it wouldn't go through probate. My brother got her wedding china. My parents got a savings bond worth about $8,000 and a handwritten note I never read but heard about for years afterward. They lost their minds. Not right away. My mother is a long-game person. For about 2 years after Constance died, my mother was the warmest, sweetest, most attentive version of herself I'd ever experienced. She called me every Sunday. She asked about my work. She sent me articles about Toronto restaurants she thought I'd like. She remembered my birthday for the first time since I was a teenager. It was the kind of love bombing that, if you didn't know what you were looking at, would feel like reconciliation. Like maybe she'd actually thought about things. Like maybe my father had finally said something. But I knew what I was looking at. I'd been studying it my whole life. I let her in just enough. I'd meet her for lunch at the Pearl on King Street once a month. I'd let her ask casual little questions about whether I'd put any of Constance's money into anything. I'd give her vague non-answers. I never told her that the bulk of it was in a holding company I'd set up with a lawyer downtown, structured the way my grandmother had wanted, with conditions and signatories and a fiduciary firewall that would have given my mother an aneurysm if she'd understood it. I never told her that the Cedar House was in the company's name, not mine personally. I never told her that I'd quietly already directed about $300,000 of the cash position into a charitable foundation in my grandmother's name that funded high school English programs in 3 different school boards. I just smiled and said things like, "Oh, it's complicated, you know how trusts are." Meanwhile, my brother was burning through money in Calgary like it was wet kindling. He'd somehow gotten through the business program. He'd somehow lost it. He'd somehow started a consulting business. He'd somehow lost that too. He'd met a woman named Bristol at a charity gala in Banff. Bristol had a smile like a knife and an Instagram full of yacht weeks. Bristol wanted to get married. The wedding was set for the May long weekend at the Royal York in Toronto, which is a venue that costs roughly what a starter home costs in most of this country. My mother called me in February to tell me my brother had asked her if she would walk him down the aisle, which she said with the air of someone announcing a Nobel Prize. I made an appropriate noise. Then she said, "And of course we'd love for you to be involved, sweetheart. We were thinking, since you're so close to the business side of things, maybe you could help your brother and Bristol get organized. They're starting a little venture together. Just paperwork. Just signatures." I said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it for very long. I'd already started thinking about it the day she called me sweetheart for the 4th time in one phone call. I drove up to the Cedar House on the bay the next weekend. I sat on the porch in my grandmother's old wool coat, and I drank tea out of her favorite mug, and I watched the ice on the water, and I thought about it the way she had taught me to think about things. Slowly, with patience, from the end backwards. By Tuesday morning, I had a plan. I called my mother and told her I'd love to help with the paperwork. I told her I'd come to the wedding. I told her I'd even give a toast. She cried on the phone. She told me she was so proud of who I'd become. She told me Constance would have been proud too. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, and I told her I loved her. The next month, Bristol emailed me. She wanted to get the boring stuff out of the way before the wedding so we can just enjoy the day. She sent me a draft articles of incorporation for a numbered Alberta company. She sent me a draft shareholders agreement. She sent me a draft general power of attorney just for the wedding week in case anything urgent comes up while you're celebrating. She sent me a draft of a personal loan guarantee for a line of credit through a private lender in Calgary. The loan was for $1.8 million. The guarantor on the loan was me. I read every single page 3 times. I sent the documents to a lawyer I'd worked with on a previous file, a quiet woman in her 60s who'd seen everything, and I asked her to confirm what I was seeing. She called me back the next day and said, in the careful, neutral voice of someone who knows you're recording, "Hollis, if you sign these as drafted, your future sister-in-law and her associates will have full signing authority over your corporate accounts for the week of May 17th through May 24th, including the holding company, including the house." She paused. Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were doing. "This is not a wedding document," I said. "I know." She said, "What do you want to do?" I said, I want to sign it. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Tell me more." I told her more. I told her about the car. I told her about the scholarship. I told her about every Christmas where my brother got a new laptop and I got socks. I told her about the cedar house. I told her about my grandmother's last phone call. The one where Constance had said, in that dry teacher's voice, "Hollis, listen to me. They will come for it. Not soon, but they will come for it. And when they do, I want you to be ready. Don't be soft. Don't be loud. Just be ready." My lawyer was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "All right, let's get you ready." What I did next is the part I'm not going to fully explain on the internet, because some of it I did at work and some of it I did using systems that civilians don't have access to, and the rest of it I did with the help of people whose names I'm never going to say out loud. But I'll tell you the shape of it. I signed the documents. I signed them in front of a notary in Toronto on a Thursday afternoon in April. I had my lawyer present. I had a witness. I signed every single page, including the power of attorney and the loan guarantee. And I had the notary stamp them. And I had 3 certified copies made. And I sent 1 set back to Bristol by courier. What Bristol didn't know, and what my brother didn't know, and what my mother absolutely didn't know, was that the holding company they thought they were getting signing authority over had been restructured 11 days earlier. The Cedar House had been transferred into a separate numbered company in Ontario whose sole director was a fiduciary firm in Vancouver. The bulk of the cash position had been redistributed into the charitable foundation, with the rest in instruments that could not be liquidated without 2 signatures, mine and the fiduciary's. What remained in the holding company they'd be touching was a clean, ordinary-looking pool of about $40,000 in a checking account and a series of digital tripwires. The tripwires were the part I'd built myself. I'd set them up the way you set up a foothold. Any login from a device that wasn't mine would trigger a notification to my phone. Any attempted transfer over $5,000 would freeze the account and ping the bank's fraud line directly. Any attempt to use the power of attorney would generate a time-stamped log that fed into a CRA flag I'd quietly attached to the holding company's file 3 months earlier under a routine compliance review that nobody would think to question. And the loan guarantee, the one for $1.8 million, was tied to a personal credit file that I had locked the week before with a fraud alert citing anticipated identity theft by known parties with documentation. If they tried anything at all, every door I'd left cracked open would slam shut at the same time, and the noise would bring people running who do not run for ordinary noises. I went to the wedding. I wore a long green dress my grandmother would have liked. I did my hair myself. I sat at the head table and I clapped at the right times and I laughed at the speeches and I let Bristol's mother tell me 3 times that she'd heard so much about me. I gave the toast I'd prepared. It was about how marriage is a long act of trust and how trust is the most expensive thing any of us will ever own, and how I hoped my brother and his new wife understood the weight of what they were taking on. My brother laughed nervously into his glass. Bristol smiled like she was being photographed. The reception moved upstairs to one of the smaller ballrooms after dinner with a smaller crowd, mostly family and close friends. That's where the laptop appeared. That's where my mother started gripping the stem of her glass. That's where Bristol leaned across the head table and said, "Hollis, sweetie, would you mind just popping over for a sec? My dad wants to take a picture of the 4 of us, and then we want to run through one quick thing about the joint announcement." There was no joint announcement. There was no picture. What there was my brother sitting at the head table with the laptop open. Bristol was on his left. My mother was on his right. My father was hovering behind, doing his throat-clearing thing. The screen showed a login portal for the holding company's banking interface, and the login fields were already filled in. They had my username. They had a password. The password was wrong because I'd changed it the night before, but it was very close to what it used to be, which told me everything I needed to know about which of my devices they'd touched and when. My brother said, with this awful eager smile, "Hey, sis, we just need you to confirm the login. There's a security thing." Bristol said, "It'll just take a second." My mother said, "It's just for the venture, sweetheart, just like we talked about." I didn't sit down. I stood next to the table and I looked at the 4 of them, and I felt nothing. I want to be honest about that. I'd thought I would feel something, triumph or grief or anger or some big cinematic wave. I felt nothing. Just a kind of distant attention, the way you watch a kettle. I said, Whose ID did you use to reset the password? Nobody answered. I said it again. Whose ID? My mother said, Hollis, don't make a scene. I said, I'm not making a scene. I'm asking a question. Whose ID did you use? Bristol's smile flickered, just slightly. My brother said, Mom, what is she talking about? My mother's face did the thing it did when she was about to pivot. The softening around the eyes. The little tilt of the head. She said, Sweetheart, I had a copy of your old health card. I just had it from when you were a teenager. It was nothing. I said, an old health card wouldn't have gotten you into that account. My father cleared his throat. My mother said, we may have had to update some things with the bank as a courtesy to make the family business run more smoothly. You understand? I said, you used a forged ID to log into my bank account. Bristol said very quickly, Hollis, let's not throw words around. Let's just confirm the login. There's a process. I said, there is a process. I said it slowly. I said it the way my grandmother used to say things at the kitchen table when she was about to grade somebody. Then I said, go ahead. Try. My brother looked at my mother. My mother looked at Bristol. Bristol looked at the laptop. There was a long pause where I could hear the string quartet from the floor below, the murmur of the bar, the laugh of somebody in the hall. My mother reached over my brother's hands and entered the password they had. She hit enter. The screen flickered. A small red banner appeared at the top of the login portal. It said, AC count frozen. Security, it's quote. And progress. Please contact your bank. My mother's face went very still. Bristol's hand went to her mouth. My brother said, what very still? Bristol's hand went to her mouth. My brother said, what? Hollis, what does that mean? I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. About 4 seconds later, my phone buzzed in my clutch. Then it buzzed again. Then the door at the far end of the small ballroom opened, and 2 men in plain dark suits walked in, and behind them was a uniformed Toronto police officer. And behind her was a woman in a navy blazer with a lanyard around her neck that I recognized because I'd seen it on people in my own building. CRA Criminal Investigations. It turned out, and I learned this over the next several months in pieces, that the loan guarantee documents Bristol had drafted were tied to a Calgary private lender who was, himself, under investigation for an entirely separate matter that had nothing to do with my family but everything to do with where the money for Bristol's consulting venture was actually coming from. The CRA had been watching that lender for almost 2 years. The moment my flagged holding company tripped against that file, alarms went off in 3 different offices in 2 different cities. The Toronto police were there because forging a federal ID is a criminal offense in this country, and because my lawyer had filed a complaint on my behalf the previous afternoon, sealed pending the wedding to be unsealed the second the login attempt was made. My mother tried, at first, to play dumb. She said, officers, this is a misunderstanding. My daughter and I were just... The CRA investigator, who I will not name, said, ma'am, we have a time-stamped login attempt from a device registered to your son's address using credentials reset through a piece of provincial photo identification that we have reason to believe was altered. Please don't speak. We're going to step into the hallway. My brother started to cry. He's almost 35 years old, and he started to cry at his own wedding reception in front of his new wife and his new in-laws in a string quartet that had stopped playing somewhere along the way. Bristol stood up so fast her chair tipped over. She said, I had nothing to do with this. I had nothing to do with this. About 6 times, to nobody in particular. My father just sat down on the chair behind him and put his hands over his face. I walked out of the ballroom. I walked down the wide, curved staircase. I walked through the lobby of the Royal York, past a wedding party that wasn't mine, past a doorman who held the door for me, out onto Front Street, where the May air smelled like rain and streetcars and the faint sweetness from a hot dog cart on the corner. I crossed the street. I sat down on a bench by Union Station. I called my lawyer. I said, it's done. She said, go home, Hollis, eat something, sleep. I'll handle the rest. I went home. I ate a piece of toast standing at my kitchen counter. I slept 12 hours. The fallout, when it came slowly, the way it tends to when these things are real. Bristol turned out to be only minimally involved in the original ID scheme and pled out in exchange for testifying against the Calgary lender, which I am told led to several other very interesting prosecutions. My brother got 2 years less a day on fraud and forgery charges and is now living I'm told, in a basement apartment in Lethbridge. My mother got the worst of it, which I think is right. The CRA proceedings around the altered ID and the unauthorized access took 18 months to play out. She got a custodial sentence of just under 4 years. She'll be out in less than that if she behaves, which I doubt. My father, who I genuinely believe was too stupid to understand what was happening but too cowardly to ask, took a plea on a lesser charge and got a suspended sentence and a permanent restraining order from any account I'm associated with. He sends me letters sometimes. I don't open them. My grandmother's cedar house on the bay is mine now, fully and finally in my own personal name. I spent the first weekend up there alone, last fall after the final ruling came through. I built a fire in her old stone fireplace. I made tea in her favorite mug. I sat on the porch with her wool coat over my shoulders and I watched the lights come on across the water in the cottages on the far shore. I thought about what she'd said. Don't be soft. Don't be loud. Just be ready. The Constance Foundation funds English programs in 17 school boards now. We focus especially on kids from low-income families and kids in care. Every year, I read the applications myself, on weekends, in front of that fireplace. There's always one in the pile that stops me. A kid who wrote something true. A kid whose hands are shaking on the page. I write a note in the margin and I move them to the top. People ask me sometimes, when the story comes up obliquely, whether I feel guilty about how it ended. Whether I think I went too far. I always say the same thing. I say, my mother got into a bank account that wasn't hers using a piece of ID that wasn't real, with my brother and his wife at her elbow, at a wedding I paid for the wine at after 16 years of pretending none of this had ever happened. I didn't do anything to her. She walked into a room I had prepared. The trap was already there. She brought herself, and every time I drive up to the bay, every time I turn off the highway onto that long gravel road through the cedars, every time I see the lake open up at the end of it, I think about my grandmother's hands around a teacup, and I think about how patient she was. And I think about how the quiet ones see everything. And I think, yes, Gran. I was ready. I am still ready. I've thought about that night at the Royal York more times than I can count, and the conclusion I always come back to is this. Nothing that happened in that ballroom was an accident. Not really. Every single thing my mother did at that head table was something she had practiced, in smaller ways, for 30 years. She had practiced it the night she pinned a youth conviction on a 16-year-old in a wet ditch outside Hamilton. She had practiced it every time she handed my brother a new pair of skates and handed me a lecture about being grateful. She had practiced it every Sunday for 2 years after Constance died, when she called me sweetheart in a voice she'd never used before, building toward a future she could already see in her head. People don't suddenly become capable of forging a piece of provincial ID and walking into a bank with it. They become capable of it the way a river becomes a canyon, slowly and by repeating the same small movement over and over until the ground gives up. The thing I want anyone watching this to understand is that the cause and the effect were never separate. My mother's life caught up with her at a wedding reception because she had spent decades building exactly the kind of person who would end up arrested at a wedding reception. I didn't cause that. I just stopped standing in the way of it. Constance taught me something in those quiet weekends on the bay that took me years to actually hear. She used to say that character is just the sum of what you do when no one's looking, and that a person who lies in small ways will lie in big ways the moment the big ways become available. She believed in 3 things, in roughly this order. She believed in being decent, even when no one would know. She believed in being smart, which to her meant patient, which to her meant willing to wait years for something to become clear. And she believed in being strong, which she did not mean as loudness, but as the steady refusal to let other people define what your life was going to mean. I lost a lot of years to soft thinking. I lost a scholarship and a city and a version of myself that might have been lighter, easier, less watchful. I'm not getting those back, but I gained something my mother will never have, which is the ability to sit alone in a quiet house in the cedars and feel at peace with the person I see in the window glass. She'll spend the rest of her life telling herself a story where she's the victim. I'll spend the rest of mine doing what my grandmother asked, which is reading the applications from kids whose hands shake on the page and writing notes in the margins that might change the shape of their next 10 years. Be decent. Be patient. Be ready. The trap will set itself. You just have to know who you are when the door swings shut.